Hello and welcome. So, we are going to be looking at gender and how gender can impact learning that happens in our classrooms, and also how teachers can ensure that they're providing an equitable learning environment. So, before we begin, I think it's nice to start with some terminology to make sure that we're all defining our terms the same way. So, there's a difference between sex and gender. So, sex is looking at your biology. So, sex is something that can be determined before you're even born. Gender is a little bit different. So, gender is looking at more of a social construct, what our ideas are regarding male and female, masculinity and femininity, what roles go along with that, what behaviors go along with that, what psychological traits go along with that. Because of that, it is something that is more malleable. I thought it might be interesting to think about this idea of gender roles over time. This idea that since gender is, again, a social construct, how our view of what a woman looks like and what a woman does, and same thing for men, how this has changed over time. So let's dig a little bit deeper into terminology regarding gender. So, gender can be further broken down into gender identity and gender expression. So, gender identity is more internal, how I view myself, how I define myself, whereas gender expression is more of my outward expression of my gender identity, how I present myself to others through what I wear, and how I have my appearance for others. So let's start to take a look at some differences between the genders or differences between the sexes. So, what are some common differences that you know of or you've heard between males and females? Anything you can think of? Well, considering my history in teaching psychology, I've spent a variety of time looking at research differences that have been found between genders. These are not for notes, but I wanted to explain some of these to you. So, there have been found some universal differences in play. Girls tend to prefer cooperative play, quiet play. So when they're playing, they usually try to work together with the person that they're playing with, and they tend to play in smaller groups. And they tend to use more fine motor skills. Boys tend to use gross motor skills, more of what we call a rough and tumble play. They prefer things like blocks and action figures and toy guns and transportation toys. They tend to play in larger groups when available, and their play is more competitive. So rather than the girls who are working together towards a common goal, the boys are trying to win, trying to dominate typically. And what's interesting is this difference in play is universal. It is found across the globe, so it's not considered really to be an environmental difference. Some other differences we find in the sexes include more psychological traits. Girls tend to have more anxiousness. They are more sociable, talking to and wanting to spend time with others. They tend to be more trusting and more trusting of authority figures. They also, oh gosh, another big finding of them is that they tend to be more interdependent. So they tend to have more empathy and think about others more. Boys tend to be more assertive, more aggressive, which sometimes helps them do better in the workforce. They tend to be more interdependent and be more confident and have higher self-esteem. So some of the differences for your notes are focused more on academics. So IQ tests, remember we talked about the Stanford-Binet intelligence test. Males and females have very similar mean scores. Our bell curve is a little bit different, but the mean score is pretty much the same. But there are some differences when it comes to specialized academic skills. Males tend to do better at math and visual spatial skills. Females tend to do better with verbal skills. I have an example down below looking historically at SAT scores, which shows this difference in math. It has been said that perhaps due to some of these differences might be why males are more likely to pursue careers in architecture, and sometimes are better at video games than females are. And females tend to be better at expressing and writing their feelings. So let's continue. Let's take a look briefly at some things that teachers can do to try to build an equitable education for both the males and females in their classes. First of all, you want to make sure you encourage academic excellence in all of your students, that you have high expectations for all of your students. You don't want to go into a math lesson and go into it assuming, well, my boys are going to do better than my females do. Have high expectations for all of your students. Next, have unconditional positive regard. Regardless of what gender traits you might see in your students, that you need to have high regard for all of your students unconditionally, that you want to make sure your learning environment, your classroom is welcoming and accepting to your students, that they all feel like they have a place in your class and that you care about them. And then lastly, that you want to make sure that you're presenting models in your class that are not necessarily gender stereotypical. And sometimes that can be hard to avoid. I mean, when you look at movies like Disney, for instance. So I provided some examples down below. So try to provide some non-stereotypical role models to help foster equity in your classroom. Not only will this help to encourage a positive classroom, but remember, there are also legal statutes in place. According to Title IX, the Education Act of 1972, teachers cannot discriminate based upon gender. Now let's dig a little bit deeper when talking about gender, and let's take a look at this idea of gender differences, okay? Research can point to a variety of origins for gender differences, both environmental and biology. This is actually part of a larger debate, this idea of nurture versus nature. Is one more important than the other, or do they work together? Okay, so nurture is the environmental differences, your upbringing, how your parents treated you and raised you, the schools you went to, the friends you had, how you're nurtured to behave a certain way. Nature is looking at your biology, your genetics, and hormones and other things that help to control things like gender. Let's take a look at both of these. We're going to start with nurture. So, one way that nurture is defined is through socialization. And we've already talked about how gender is a social construct. Studies have found that children are actually treated differently based upon our gender expectations that we have. Let's do a quick demonstration of this. So here I've got a picture of just a typical little infant. How would you describe this infant? So think to yourself, would you describe this infant as firm or soft, little or big, strong or delicate, well-coordinated or clumsy, beautiful or plain? What if instead of showing you this infant, I showed you this infant? Would your descriptors have changed any? What about this? Let's say you're going shopping for one of these babies. Would the clothes that you buy differ based upon the picture you're presented with? Or the type of gifts that you give? Or how you might compliment them and what you might compliment first? And which infant would you play more roughly with? There have been some really interesting studies of adult interaction with babies, and what we tend to find is if we believe the baby is a female, we tend to compliment their appearance and talk about them being pretty or beautiful. If we believe the infant is a male, we tend to compliment how strong or independent they are. There's also differences in how we play with those infants. Here are some examples from my personal life. So these are cousins of mine, and this was on, I believe their second or third birthday. And you can see differences in the toys they received. So my female cousin received a dress-up kit, which she was so pleased to open. When she opened it up, the exact words out of her mouth was, "This is all for me." And she put all these items on and paraded around the room. My male cousin received a set of Nerf balls, a basketball, a football, and a soccer ball, and he loved them. So there were differences in what they received. And then I noticed there were also differences in how they were interacted with. So my female cousin, she sat down quietly and played nicely with the other ladies who were there at the birthday party. My male cousin played with the gaggle of other male cousins in our family in a rough and tumble play. So I just had to take pictures of this because I thought, wow, this really fits with what we talk about in class. So again, we treat children differently based upon gender expectations. Girls are typically expected to be quiet and well-behaved, Boys are expected to be more independent, assertive, and emotionally stable. I'll often hear parents comment to their children about how boys shouldn't cry. That idea, oh, you're supposed to be tough. You're not supposed to be upset by things. That differential treatment, no wonder, can lead to differential behaviors. If you've ever heard of the psychological term of self-fulfilling prophecy, this kind of fits here. The idea that when you expect things to happen in a certain way, you behave in that way and you almost cause those things to happen. So interesting. You can also really clearly see this when you look at the toy aisles in stores. The big difference between the boys aisle and the girls aisle on toys, what they look like, how you're supposed to play with them, what type of behaviors you would engage in with them. That's not the only way that the environment can shape our gender. It can also occur through something called social learning theory. This is a fascinating field of psychology, the idea that children learn by watching and imitating. So they see the people in their lives and they imitate the things that those people tend to do, and they tend to imitate the same gender role models. So this is a little demonstration we would do in class, but just think to yourself, in your family, between your mom or your dad, or whomever your caregivers may be, if you need to think of aunts, uncles, grandparents, whomever, which gender was more likely to do the laundry? Which gender was more likely to mow the yard? Which gender was more likely to make dinner? Which gender was more likely to have a toolbox? Which gender would you call if you needed to change a flat tire? Which gender would you call if you needed help sewing up something on your clothes? That we tend to see that there are different behavioral expectations. And then we see that in our adult role models and we tend to imitate that. We also imitate that through things we see on TV. I think Disney has started to change some, but if you look back to Disney from the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s, there are clear stereotypical role models there. All right, so that's environment. That's the nurture side. Remember, there's nurture and then there's nature. The nature side is our biology. So biology also plays a huge role in this. So not only are there genetic differences between males and females, but think about hormones. Our hormone levels are not incredibly different until puberty, and that's when you see a great increase in hormones. And those hormones drive physiological changes that occur between males and females. It changes physical shape to where males start to get what we call the triangle shape, and females start to get the hourglass shape to their body. Physical changes in sex organs. There are some researchers who also say that there could be some brain research looking at hemispheric differences between males and females, which might explain why males are better at math and females are better at verbal skills. But still, going back to biology. So thinking of this made me think of a case study I wanted to mention just to kind of show the importance of biology. I've been teaching psychology and human development for over 20 years. Well over 20 years. And I remember around the year 2000, I saw this episode on Oprah about a book that had just come out called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Girl. And it was fascinating. And I took clips from that Oprah episode and I would show it in class and talk about it. And I thought it would be a good way to emphasize again the role of biology. So let's take a look at this. So this all happened around the 1960s. Johns Hopkins University was sponsoring research by one of their doctors, Dr. John Money, he had done a case study and he was claiming the role of environment on gender. Now that's different than what I'm using this for. Remember, I'm using this to show biology. He was trying to say environment is the main impetus for gender. He had a case called the John Joan case. It was an experiment that occurred after two twin boys went in to be circumcised. One of the circumcisions went well. The other one was botched. There was a malfunction of the equipment, and the equipment was set at too high of a heat, and it basically castrated the second young boy. So here we have two distraught parents, and they have two identical twin sons. one who was circumcised and had a normal penis, and the other one whose penis was basically castrated, and they didn't know what to do. They heard about this study at Johns Hopkins that was being done, and they went there to consult with Dr. Honestly, I don't know if it's Money or Money, so I'm going to refer to it as Money. He told the parents that, you know what, if you raise this child as a girl, and later in life around puberty, have us start to administer hormones and things, you could simply just raise this child as a female. Case closed, problem solved. He published his experiment. He said it was a great success. But then as time went on and more details came out, it was discovered that it really wasn't a success. It's not that easy as changing a label and saying, okay, I'm going to raise you as a female now. John was simply the anonymous names, the pseudonyms given for the study. The young boy was raised under the name of Brenda. So Brenda grew up being told she was a female. She never knew her true identity because remember the botched circumcision occurred when she was a baby. We don't have memories of those events. For all she knew, she was a female. But she always refused to act like a female. For instance, the mom describes when she first put a dress on Brenda. She said Brenda ripped the dress off and refused to wear it. They would teach their children different bathroom behaviors for the different sexes. Brenda refused to pee sitting down, and she would still pee standing up. In fact, that became such a problem at school, they had a separate bathroom for Brenda to use. Brenda was rejected by her classmates because she didn't act as a traditional, typical female would. Remember that idea of societal norms for gender? She continued to show male behaviors. She engaged in rough and tumble play as boys did. She wasn't interested in boys as the girls were. She wasn't interested in playing with dolls as the girls were. So around the age of 14, she threatened suicide. She had been going back to regular visits at Johns Hopkins to be checked up on and for hormones. And around the age of 14, she said, if you take me back to Johns Hopkins again, I will kill myself. And her parents decided, okay, it's time to tell her the truth. And they sat her down and told her what had happened and that she was really born a male. And this was what they did and why they did it. She immediately resumed her male identity, started going by the name of David, eventually went to prom, got married, all those kinds of things. But David was still extremely troubled by all the things that he had been through. He was in his late 30s, early 30s, probably when he went on Oprah. I think he was on Oprah in 2000, and he committed suicide in 2004 because of the extreme depression he had through what he had been through. So again, it's a traumatic, difficult study. It's you can still find that Oprah episode online. That was one of the first times that he actually publicly showed his face on TV and told his story. But all of this just to show that really biology is important also within the role of gender. So even though I'm saying gender is a social construct, it's hard to separate sex from gender. It's hard to separate biology from environment. These things are all highly connected. So speaking of which, you might have wondered when we were going to get to the issue of looking at gender spectrum. We will only be touching the tip of the iceberg with this subject because this is an intro to teaching course. But I do at least want to make sure we have some terminology and some understandings down, and then again finish with that idea of an equitable classroom. So to start off with, some information about your LGBTQ students. It's important to understand what they're going through. So first of all, they often either are rejected by their peers or feel as if they're rejected by their peers. Similar to what Brenda went through in that story, where they may feel as if they don't fit that typical gender role. And so because of that, some of their peers might have difficulty accepting them for who they are. That can lead to feelings of depression or anxiety or alienation. So for example, if you look at the graphic down here below, if you ask a non-LGBTQ student what their biggest problem is, they're going to typically refer to troubles with their schoolwork, their exams, their grades. But when you ask that same question to an LGBTQ student, they will often say their biggest problem is feeling accepted, trouble at school with bullying and with their peers, and a fear of expressing their identity. So you can see why sometimes these individuals might turn to other outlets for their anxieties, whether it be drugs, alcohol, or even simply withdrawing. Let's go over a little bit more within the world of terminology, focusing on the term transgender. Transgender is a complicated term. It can mean different things, so I'm trying to give you the best definition of it I can. It provides information about the extent to which someone identifies with the sex and gender they were assigned at birth. It can communicate information about how they experience or understand gender, or even what pronouns they would like to go by, or how they would want to be referred to. It can also relate to individuals who are transitioning to the other gender, medically and or chemically, and want to live as the other gender. So that's just simply a nutshell for the term transgender. So some classroom thoughts. What are some ideas to help create an inclusive classroom for these students? For all of your students, as well as those who identify as LGBTQ. Something that's important to think about, whether it's something that you have experienced in your classroom, practices that you would like to continue if you yourself end up teaching in the future. So here are some thoughts. How can teachers support their LGBTQ students? Well, first of all, you need to educate yourself. You need to check for your own potential biases. Think about how you're behaving in the classroom. Are you really treating your students equitably? Other ways you need to educate yourself is to be aware of school policies, state laws, to know what's going on in the world around you and the policies that are regulating your behaviors in the classroom. What else can you do? You want to make sure that you confront any sort of unacceptable or biased behaviors you see in the classroom. I saw an interesting study that talked about how it was an observational study done in classrooms, that when teachers would hear a racial comment, a comment of racial bias, they were quick to stop it. They were, however, not as quick to stop biases or slurs regarding gender, and that they seem to treat those things as being less harmful. So any sort of comment that harasses someone or that shows bias or that is going to lead to a negative classroom environment needs to be stopped. And those students also need to be, there needs to be consequences, and they need to also have an understanding for the importance of having respect in the classroom for all of their peers. So you need to have some sort of rules against harassment. What are some other ways teachers can support their students? This is what I was just referring to. Educate your students the idea of respecting all of their students, having unconditional regard for all of their peers. Think about the books that you're teaching in class. Are there ways that you can exemplify this in your own behavior? What can you do to make sure that your students understand the importance of being respectful? Okay, so thank you so much. I realized on playback that the audio quality of this video isn't quite as good as some of my other ones. I don't have my headset on, so I'm sorry about that. In regards to that, I will end this video with a cute picture, if I can get them to cooperate. And my recent, well, let's see. Can you see? Oh, there they are. This is Totoro, the gray chinchilla. Hello, Miss Totoro. Can you say hi? Totoro is new. She's only been here for a couple days. And right behind her, you can see Miss Misty. So I have not cleaned their cage yet, so sorry if it's a little bit dirty. Miss Totoro's not super crazy about cameras, but those are two of my little buggers I'm sitting here babysitting today. So thank you for your participation and for your patience in listening to me. Thank you.